Hello everyone, I'm reading my class the story Roald Dahl's The TWITS. This is part 4 of our class read aloud. So if you haven't heard part 1, 2 and 3, go back and look at those videos first. We're up to the part Mrs. Twit gets a stretching. You might recall that Mr. Twit has fooled Mrs. Twit into thinking she's shrinking. So he's told her there's only one thing to do but to stretch her. He's just paying her back for a nasty prank she did by putting worms in his spaghetti for dinner. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors, where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling up the balloons with helium, and he had fixed an iron ring to the ground. "Stand here," he said, pointing to the iron ring attached to the ground. He then tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled the string, trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the string to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied around her neck, some under her arms, and some to her wrists, and some even to her hair. Soon there were 50 coloured balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. Here's the picture. "Can you feel them stretching?" asked Mr. Twit. I can, said Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." He put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now. With her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons, she was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson from putting the worms in his spaghetti. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me." What's going to happen? Has that given Mr. Twit an idea? Mrs. Twit goes ballooning up. "There's enough pull here to take me to the moon," Mrs. Twit cried out. "To take you to the moon?" exclaimed Mr. Twit. "What a ghastly thought. We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh dear me, no." "We most certainly wouldn't," cried Mrs. Twit. "Put some more string around my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe." "Very well, my angel," said Mr. Twit, with a ghoulish grin on his lips. He knelt down at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket and with one quick slash cut all the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. "Help!" she screamed. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds, she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below looking up. "Ah, what a pretty sight," he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky, and what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last, the old lady is lost and gone forever." They don't love each other, these two, do they? See that? Let's read the next chapter. We're on page 31. Mrs. Twit comes ballooning down. Mrs. Twit may have been ugly and she may have been beastly, but she was not silly. High up there in the sky, she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "I will stop going up and I will start to come down." She began biting through the strings. Good plan. She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists and arms and neck. and her hair. Each time she bit through a string, let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and less, and the rate of climb slowed down. When she had bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether. She stayed still. She bit through one more string. Very, very slowly, she began to float down. It was a calm day and there was no wind at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. She now began to come absolutely straight down. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute. Petticoat is a skirt that people wear under their dresses. But it showed her long knickers. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at this extraordinary old woman floating in the sky. Mr. Twit gets a horrible shock. We're up to page 33 if you're following along with your book. Mr. Twit, who thought he had seen his horrible wife for the last time, was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. He doesn't know. When she was about the height of the house, above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice, "Here I come, you grisly old grunion, you rotten old turnip, you filthy old frumpet." By the way, Roald Dahl sometimes makes up silly words like frumpet. Mr. Twit jumped as though he had been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his drink and he looked up. He gasped. And he gasped. And he gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth. "I'll get you for this," shouted Mrs. Twit, and she was floating down right on top of him. She was purple with rage, slashing the air with her long walking stick, which she had somehow managed to hang on to all this time. "I'll swish you to a swazzle," she shouted. "I'll swash you to a swizzle. I'll gnash you to a nozzle. I'll nosh you to a nazzle." These are all made-up words from the author Roald Dahl. And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and fiery fury, that's anger, landed right on top of him, lashing out with the stick and cracking him all over his body. Okay, I'll stop part 4 there on page 35. There are only 2 characters so far in this story. See, a good book doesn't always need lots of characters, as long as the characters are interesting and there's a problem in the story. What's the problem in this story? What's the overall problem between these 2 characters? That's something to think about. See you soon.